Thank you very much, Mr. Shevin, and it's great to be here. This is the first time that I'm making a presentation here at ES. Is it okay for me to stay seated, because I think they are taking a camera, or is it better for me to stand?
What makes you feel more comfortable?
I like to stand so that I can look at people better. Okay, but then I won't have the.
Do you have a photo? You can put it on the chair. No, go ahead.
Okay, so. No, I think that's fine. Let me say, because I think it's easier then for everyone. I've been in Egypt since July of last year, so I've just completed my 11th month, I guess, in this country. And before coming here, I was in South Africa for 3 years. And I developed an interest in trying to understand how institutions in South Africa have evolved. And for those of you who know South Africa a little bit, or at least have read about it, it is a very unique country that has come from a very torturous past with a lot of difficult times. And it is trying to remake itself in the new world. So since over the last 22 years, it has been trying to redefine itself and its institutions. And it comes from a very unique handicap where a large part of the population was excluded from economic activity, from political activity. So there are some unique features of that. But then when we look at a lot of the institutional changes that have taken place in South Africa, we realize that there are a lot of things that South Africa has done that actually, other countries are also struggling to do. So we thought, can we just package some of these things on how South Africa has been able to establish certain centers of excellence in selected spheres. And the focus was not so much on the what or the why, because the what and the why we all know and we can talk about it, but on the how to. How did South Africa succeed in developing these institutions? So what we decided to do was that we adopted a case study approach to looking at some sectors. I think we picked about 12 sectors, and I'm going to talk about it very briefly. We developed a uniform structure to analyze all of those in a similar manner, almost like a Harvard Business School type of case study, looking at what were the initial conditions when South Africa became a democracy in 1994, what was done, what were the results, and how were they achieved. And we tried in our case studies to use as much of data as possible, because I think it has to be based upon evidence, not just what some people say. But then we also wanted that data to be informed by the actual experiences of policymakers, people who actually did those things, so that it provides a much more realistic flavor of how the reforms were done, because data tells you what was done and what the results were, but not so much the how to. And we established a panel of experts of South Africa who are outside of government to help form an advisory group that can help us with the quality, so make sure that the quality and the objectivity was assured. So, and I'm putting it out there because, when we do case studies, it's very important to ensure the quality of a case study, because otherwise people can do all sorts of case studies without objectivity. So we picked 12 case studies, and I shall provide a little bit of a flavor of each one of them, and then try to draw some conclusions that we can then discuss on whether there is some relevance for Egypt or not. So very simple charts, and these are very simple scorecards on different aspects. So this is a country, South Africa, where it's very highly centralized, in some ways a centralized state at the start, but also completely racially divided. So at the time of the end of apartheid in South Africa, there were all these what were called Bantustan, small areas that were completely set up as self-governing units, but they were controlled by the center, very racially divided states. Now what you have is a unitary state with a very highly decentralized system. And I know that in Egypt also there are discussions about decentralization. South Africa developed a very highly decentralized system, which we do a case study on. If you look at the allocation of spending, which is one aspect of that decentralization, you see that now a lot of the funds, more than half of the budget, is actually goes towards the subnational government spending. The legal framework for decentralization is very clearly defined, if you look over this 20-year period. Budget transparency. I think one of the things that I was most impressed in South Africa was how open and transparent the budget was. I don't know whether how many of you know, but there's a global index called the Open Budget Index, and I'm sure Avla knows about it, which is put out by some independent organization. It's not a World Bank index. And they rank countries, different countries on the level of openness and transparency of the budget. So normally you would expect countries like New Zealand and UK and Sweden and the United States, etc., to be at the top, which they are. But the only emerging market country that is in the top is South Africa. And South Africa actually vies with New Zealand for the number one spot. So one year New Zealand is number one, another year South Africa is number one. And that is a remarkable achievement because budget transparency in some ways is at the core of the contract that the state has with its citizens. The state collects revenues, spends. How does it collect? How does it spend? For what programs? So that the citizens know. So every line item of the budget, you can actually go and find out how much is spent on a hospital in a certain province in a particular year. So that there's full transparency. And that is made available possible because of systems. There's an ICT-based system that actually provides that. But not only that, the budget is formulated on a 3-year basis. I know that we have some distinguished parliamentarians, and you're looking at the budget of Egypt also at this point in time. South Africa's budgeting, if you look at the whole budget process, it's a 3-year budget. There's a citizens' budget. Actually, Egypt has just introduced a citizens' budget. I think they put out some information. But it's a well-established tradition of a citizen budget, and it's actually advertised in newspapers, and it is so easy and so simple to read that even if I'm a high school student, I need some level of literacy. But if my daughter, for instance, can read it and can understand what are the major areas in how the government collects taxes and how the government spends and what are the priorities, very simple. And if you want to go into more detail, you can go. So I think it is very important, for this contract. And for South Africa, it was very important because it was coming from an era where the citizens were excluded. For the vast majority of the citizens were excluded from budget formulation and policy making. To involve those citizens in that was an aspiration of the people that they had to live up to. And this is how they did that. Revenues. So this was a country with a very relatively, they still had decent revenue collections, tax collections, even at the time of apartheid, because it's, as you know, it's a highly mineral-rich country, as also a lot of large businesses in South Africa. So most of the tax revenues came from that. But they were able to improve tax collections by improving the efficiency and by broadening the tax base. One other aspect of the social contract that the South Africans were trying to promote was that before the end of apartheid, and this is a country, South Africa has about 50 million people, so only about 2.6 million people were actually income taxpayers. Now, there are 16.8 million people who are actually taxpayers. That gives a sense of involvement, citizenry. And I think, again, this is part of that nation building that the South African state was embarked upon. And then they have used technology very effectively to broaden the tax base. So now e-filing, you can file taxes 5 minutes before midnight of the closing date, and it is very smooth. Monitoring and evaluation. One of the questions for the government was a lot of ambitious programs, but how do we know whether we are achieving the ends? How do we measure ourselves? And there's no perfect answer to that. Countries have to find their own ways. And they started a bit late. It is only over the last few years that they have tried to establish a monitoring and evaluation system across government. So a few years ago, they came up with a national development plan, much as what Egypt has come out with in terms of 2030. So they also had a longer-term vision. And then they have developed a monitoring and evaluation framework driven from the presidency. And it is establishing roots in the country, and I think we assess how they have actually gone about doing that. And I think their ambition is very high because they really want to put out data and evaluations in the public domain so that citizens know what is happening and what is working and what is not working. All of that data comes out at the end of the year in a book that is put on the web. You can actually go and check that web with data and the evaluations. They're all made public. Statistics. South Africa has a first-rate statistical system. The South African statistical system is absolutely top class, but it was not that way when it started. It was a very small, fragmented thing. It focused only on collecting data from certain parts of the economy, from certain parts of the population. Even the census would ignore, some of the majority population would focus only in urban areas and selected parts. So now you have the comprehensive census, which is a first-rate census that gets conducted periodically, and you have a whole statistical system which is non-racial, because the racial transformation of society was an important socio-political objective for the government, and the data is all made public. So all the data, if you go on, it's one of the best websites that I have seen among emerging market economies in terms of how they put out the statistics. The HIV/AIDS system in South Africa, that is a very unique phenomenon in Southern Africa. As you know, this is a major, a very pernicious problem that has really decimated large segments of the population in many countries in Africa, and South Africa was also afflicted by that. And it took a while for South Africa to fully grasp the challenge, but once it did that, they have really embarked upon the largest antiretroviral treatment program in the history of the world, with tremendous effect. They now have about 2.6 million people receiving ARV drugs. Infant mortality has come down very sharply, almost by half, and average life expectancy at birth has increased. Actually, I think since we did this, I think it has gone up even further. But this is a very unique phenomenon, unique case that in that part of the world. Social transfers, targeting social transfers. So this was an important imperative of the political regime, Nelson Mandela, when he came to office at the end of apartheid. Addressing the social needs of the population was a number one priority. And what they did was that even as they focused on issues of growth, which is very important, and job creation, they also felt that they had to provide financial support to the people. So they started the social transfer program, which is a very large program, covers 16 million people. Every citizen actually receives a biometric ID card, and the data is there, and they can use that card once the money gets transferred to it at many grocery stores in different parts of the country. So there's no need to go to a social service center to get the payments. It used to be, but they have modernized this completely. The national ID and passport system, there used to be massive corruption in the issuance of IDs, passports. It used to take a lot of time. Birth registrations were not done on a timely basis. So now, through a process of modernization, and this was largely led by Mrs. Lamini Zuma, who is the chairwoman of the African Union. So when she was a minister for Home Services, she actually led this effort, and she actually cut down the time tremendously. And this is very important because it affected a lot of the poorer people, because it prevented them from accessing, if they didn't have the ID card, they could not access a lot of the services. And so they were bearing a lot of the cost of that. By doing this, it was really being very pro-poor in terms of helping support their constituencies and their support system. And by using technology, they were able to eliminate a lot of the corruption that was in the process. Biodiversity is one of the richness of South Africa. Those of you who have visited, this is a country extremely rich. But the framework for biodiversity, how do you actually use that in a sustainable manner, was limited. And there was a very strong emphasis on the state, on the public sector taking the lead. But now they have very innovative mechanisms by which there's a lot of private sector participation in managing the biodiversity resources of the country, large national parks, etc., and using them in a very sustainable manner. Highway construction and maintenance. Given the earlier apartheid era regime, the center for, or the concentration of the roads network was in terms of how Pretoria can control the country. That was the center, much like in the colonial times. I come from India, it was also how from New Delhi you can control the country. But now it became about how it can be representative and how it can cover the whole country. So there was a massive expansion of road networks, but done in a way that was very smart with very high quality standards. By setting up a specialized agency, which is the South African National Roads Agency, which was established on commercial terms and operated with a lot of professionalism. And later on, when I talk about some of the lessons from South Africa, I will talk about that. Renewable energy, this is another, I know that Egypt is also, this is a priority for the country also as it tries to expand its energy resources. And South Africa started from zero. 1994, there was nothing. And now it is a leader in renewable energy in terms of how it has been able to bring in the private sector and a lot of independent power producers. And as many of you know, the cost of renewable energy has also fallen very sharply. That actually provides for a lot of scope for private sector participation and for public sector offtake of the energy that is supplied. And the final lesson that or case study that we actually do is about the constitution, about developing a constitution in a very fragmented, fractured society. And there are very interesting stories. So I was once talking to one of the founders of the constitution in South Africa. And the leadership of Nelson Mandela was absolutely very important, because there were all these pressures from the majority population that the constitution should serve only the black community, and it should take away lands, and that it should establish certain rights, the majoritarian rights over the country and its resources. But in order to keep the country unified, in order to overcome these divisions, they established certain principles. They established a certain process of consensus building, and certain principles that actually provided for a sufficient consensus. And there was this phrase called sufficient consensus. So there was a constitution, I think much like what you all developed, I think there was an assembly that was actually that was formed for drafting the constitution. But then there was a lot of the various committees that actually tried to bring about a certain common vision towards that constitution. The Constitution, by many standards, it's one of the finest constitutions in the world, and it really enshrines many of the aspirations of the people in that, which are now being implemented in the country through the budget and various other programs. So when we did these case studies, we tried to pull together, what we think were the ingredients for success, and I'll talk briefly about those, but I'll talk about some of these ingredients. The first one that we felt was very important in the South African case was the commitment to a national goal. So this was a country that had come out from apartheid, but had a very strong sense of social justice, a very strong sense of actually making South Africa work for all of its citizens. And that clarity of national goals, some of them are anchored in the Constitution, became a very important part of it. It was also a country, because of the path that it had to take in order to get to its independence, that there was a lot of passion in what the future, and a lot of euphoria in what the future was. So there was a tremendous sense of mission to transform the country and not look backwards. In fact, there was a lot of tendency by some segments, but the leadership of Nelson Mandela and his cabinet meant that people were constantly being urged to look forward, to create something that was completely new. And they wanted to, as you know, South Africa was also subject to sanctions, etc., and had developed a bad name in the world because of its past. So they wanted to rebrand South Africa. So branding the country both regionally and globally became an important part of that. Transformational leadership was absolutely key. So initially when I thought, it must be leadership from the top. But then when we do the case studies, and if you have a chance to look at the book, which is available online, we realized that it was leadership at all levels. Yes, leadership at the presidential level, because President Mandela in the early days set the standards of how national discourse should be done and what the vision should be for the country. But then the level of the leadership by the ministers, South Africa doesn't have a prime minister, leadership by the ministers, leadership by heads of department, and leadership even by citizenry at large, including by civic organizations, became an important part in that, even by technical staff. And in some sense, there was a sense of collective leadership, because the leadership was coming from the African National Congress, which, coming from its history, had a notion of collective leadership. So that permeated the system. There was, of course, popular support for transformational change, so that made it easier because they were moving forward, carrying the popular population behind it. And there was a tremendous sense of urgency in the early days, which helped propel the leadership forward. consensus building, and I touched upon it very briefly in my earlier thing. Consensus building was very important because of the various divisions in society that existed. So there was a concerted effort to bring people together. And the way they did that was by embarking upon formal processes, but then also making them very inclusive. So I think that inclusiveness of process and the consultations became an important part of how South Africa developed some of the ideas for how they need to go forward. There was a strong belief that no matter what the difference is, we need to respect each other. And we can sit across the table, sort out our differences, and work for a better future. It is absolutely intrinsic. There was a story that a former minister who was also part of the Constitution Committee told me that they were having this discussions and they hit a block. So they woke up Nelson Mandela in the middle of the night. So he said, "What is it that you're waking me up for in the middle of the night?" They said, "Oh, we have this impasse and we don't know how to proceed." He did not solve the problem. He said, "Respect your opponent and do not personalize your relationship and find a solution." So I think this notion that you have to you actually respect each other, no matter, and these were people who have been at opposing sides, right? This is apartheid era, very brutal. There are people who have been killing each other, but to respect each other and because we are working for the larger good, and that is the good for the nation and how we want to do that. So that I think that set the tone for a lot of how even the technocrats and the people at the middle level actually went about doing their business. What is also important is that a lot of the discussions that took place in various things actually was under the public gaze. There was constant transparency and communication with using the media. And the media, had its problems and challenges and was still developing. But the transparency and communication was an important part of also keeping the citizens involved in what was going on. Learning from international experience has also been an important part, but they did it very carefully. So I was not able to find any example where they just went out and copied another country's experiences. So when they were developing the constitution, some of the people told me, from the Indian constitution, there's a directive principles to the Indian constitution. We adopted that and made it our own. But that was the only part they did from the Indian constitution. Then there were from the US constitution, they brought in some other aspects of it. Similarly, when it came to introducing the social transfer system, they looked at different experiences and borrowed examples and then modified that and made it their own. The roads agency was established largely using the New Zealand experience, but then they again adapted. So I think there was a tremendous thirst for looking at international practices and adapting it to the South African context. And of course, they got support from a lot of international agencies and various other people to do that. But it was always South Africa that was in the driver's seat on what was being done in the country. So there was no issue of any sovereignty being lost. It was very much the decision of the country. Creative, inclusive institutions. So this links a little bit to what I was talking also about consensus building. But here the focus is really developing institutions that work for the people, that work for largely the poor. And one of the things that I learned when I was talking, for instance, to Mrs. Lamini Zuma, the chairperson of the African Union, when she was the minister there was a lot of emphasis on changing the culture of public service, putting people first. So when she said it the first time, I didn't get it. So what does it really mean? How does it change? But then as you think about it, and if you read some of the chapters, you realize that is a very powerful concept. If you put the people or the citizens first, it just changes your entire way of how you want to deliver your public service. So it is a culture change, and there's no magic formula for that. But it is something that, again, leadership can try to infuse in the public servants, and that putting people first is very important. That organizations must serve a development need. Organizations cannot exist just to generate rents or to serve their own purpose. They have to serve a development need. What is it for? What is it actually doing? And whether it is an organization or parts of an organization, it has to serve a developmental need. Strong management teams became very important, and in South Africa it became an issue because the previous management teams were all white, or mostly white, so now they had to be transformed, and it was a shortage. There was a problem of getting qualified people from the majority community into service. So a lot of training had to be done in-house. And then, of course, and they actually had to provide a lot of good remuneration in order to attract some of the people to come into government, because there was an acute high demand for some of the more highly qualified professional people. And service delivery, and again, I'm not trying to say that everything is fine in South Africa. So there are massive issues on service delivery. There are demonstrations and there are riots in some of the townships where service delivery, water and power are not adequate. But there has been a continuous focus on improving service delivery. If you look at how much power, water access, school access, you look many of the indicators, there has been a massive improvement. But while the quantity has increased, quality has not increased as much, and there are still issues in terms of access for many of the people in some parts of the country. This is probably the most important, I think, picture that I wanted to share with you, and this is probably one of the lessons in terms of the political economy of change. How do you manage change? How do you drive change? And from the case studies that we did, if you start from leadership and the national purpose, I think they have very, very good strategies. South Africa is I have never seen better strategies in every different area and at the national level, in sectors as in South Africa. But strategies are still pieces of paper, so unless you implement them. So implementation has been very flexible and very pragmatic. So once I asked one of the ministers there that you guys came from a very socialist past. How come you have adopted market principles? How are you going for cost recovery? Because that is anti-communism or anti-socialism. They said, but we had to be, once we were in the ANC, in the fighting for our independence, we had to be ideological. Once we were in government, we had to be pragmatic because the needs of the people were urgent and we had to find solutions. And if you look at the budget can only provide so much. So we have to find creative solutions, including if it is cost recovery, including getting the prices right. So South Africa is one of the countries where I find there's hardly any subsidies in the system. All prices are market determined, the exchange rate is fully market determined, and even the central bank doesn't intervene in the exchange rate unless it is really needed to, for some special volatility. Where there's no energy subsidy, all product market prices are fully liberalized, all factor market prices are fully market determined. So because they had to do that in order to get to the best outcomes that they believe they needed and to generate the resources in order to drive some of their important priorities. In the case studies that things worked, focus on implementation has been key. So there has been, ministers, various people, and said that driving that implementation with targets and really motivating their staff to actually make things happen has been an important part. But in order to drive the political economy of change, it was very important to get quick results. Because quick results then feed back into the political support, and that created what I call a virtuous cycle. And I think you will appreciate, I think in Egypt also, you probably need to create these virtuous cycles that generate that political support, energy, hope. And I must say, even though I'm being recorded, that I think South Africa currently is struggling with some of these things. I think there was a phase where there was a lot of momentum, and now there's a phase where it has to sort out some of its challenges. I've already touched a little bit about the pragmatic, flexible, and innovative approaches, and this relentless drive on getting service delivery, putting people first. And I repeated it here, this bullet here, because it is so important for improvements in the state sector, that one has to put people first and solve problems. And finally, the last point that I have is really on strengthening transparency and accountability. As institutions were being developed, there are of course strong constitutional foundations for many of them. But what was very clear was that decision-making structures were very clear. So very clear decision-making structures. Who is responsible for what? And if there were complicated things that have to do with determination of wages or taxes or changes in the tax system, then there were special commissions that were established to look at the issue of taxes, how they need to be changed, what should be done over the next 5 years, 10 years, and then those very clear, transparent discussions with the public, a report put out for public consultation, and then finally submitted to the government, and then the government deliberates upon it, adopts part of it, whole of it, as the case may be. But there was a lot of process to try to put decision making on an objective basis. There's a tremendous emphasis in South Africa on using data and evidence to create this culture of evidence-based decision making. Fighting corruption has been very important because there are many stories we document in the book of how corruption, for instance, there used to be heavy corruption at the immigration service at the airport. So people would come in from other parts of the country, pay the immigration official and walk in. So there was a lot of problems. So at one day, they fired all of those people, not fired, but they removed all of those people and put in 300 completely new trained people to actually manage the immigration services. So a lot of very drastic changes in personnel to drive. Once I had the head of the social transfer agency in my office, and she came in with bodyguards, and I could see, I said, but what's going on? Oh, but she was under threat. And after my office, she went to an office of the social service, and before cameras, she actually they addressed one of the officials there who had been found of corruption, and the person was arrested, etc. But I think by doing it on camera, by making it visible, they wanted to send a message that corruption is not tolerated. So there was a little bit of shaming that was also accompanied by this action. And again, this is a constant struggle. It doesn't mean that you can bring corruption to zero, but it was a constant struggle in different agencies. The use of ICT systems to simplify the interface between citizens and the state have been very important in terms of simplifying, taking away this space for discretionary changes or incentives to actually play a role that are not officially mandated. And I also mentioned a little bit also about open budget. That has been very important for that. So what are the remaining challenges? Institutional building never stops. Institutions constantly need to keep on responding to the changing environment and uncertainties that we live in. So I do believe that institutions are endogenous. There's only so much you can create exogenously, but institutions need to grow. And I think South Africa is in that process. The inclusivity of processes, again, this is work in progress. Capacity building and skills development is absolutely key. So South Africa has made huge strides in many areas, but it still has a challenge of weak capacity in large parts of its population with high unemployment and low skills. This culture of performance, so even they are trying to build upon that, but it still has to strike deep roots. And something that one of my advisors told me, that they need to move from greater transparency. They have to change the transparency dividend that they have had into an accountability dividend. And if you follow some of the things that are going on in South Africa in terms of involving senior levels of government, I think you will find that playing itself out. So it was an interesting way for me to capture that transparency dividend does not automatically lead to an accountability, but it's part of the process to get to an accountability dividend. So you might ask, is it relevant here? And that is, I'm sure that Dr. Abla is going to try to address that. Yes, South Africa is unique, but I feel that many of the challenges are still common with many countries. And I think it shows that how inclusive public sector institutions can be developed in very difficult political environments. But of course, what we do, the design, the pace, how we do it, depends upon individual country situation. But what it does emphasize to me is that the fundamental challenge of developing and sustaining inclusive institutions in any country, I think, whether it's an advanced country or it's a developing country, I think in some things that we are learning, especially in the Middle East, that you need to have inclusive institutions in order to sustain development in a country. Thank you.